Hey everybody. Another majestic INFJ here, and I'm gonna try to make this as quick a video as possible. Um, Mainly because I want video to just be sort of background knowledge for the next video that I plan on posting, but I just wanted to sort of set the groundwork first with this one. Um, so with this video, I'm just gonna quickly go through each of the 8 cognitive functions and give what I hope to be a quick and dirty explanation of what each of the functions is doing and how to think about the functions. So then when you're thinking about typing people, you sort of know what you're looking for when you're looking for the different functions. Um, and I'm going to try to avoid all the parentheticals and the caveats and the, you know, um, getting into the nuances. And so I'll probably just give you kind of a real quick explanation of everything. And if anything seems like I'm missing a nuance or something like that, we can do a follow up video and talk about that. And, of course, leave it in the comments. Okay. So first thing, sort of two sort of ground rules here when you're thinking of cognitive functions. Number one, the function has to be conscious. Okay. So each of the cognitive functions, what they're essentially doing is you can think of it as there's basically 8 different types of things that your brain is required to do, right? 8 different types of information or 8 different types of problems or situations you're going to face or encounter as you're interacting with the world and you're interacting with people. And each of those things requires a different process, a different part of the brain to make computations, to give a response or to give an answer or to compute the information and come up with some sort of, representation or response or something, right? And because it's different types of information, you have different little pieces of your brain that compute that those different types of information, and it obviously does it differently. So as we go through it, hopefully that will make sense. um, but these are the 8 things that you do consciously. Okay, so there's lots of things that you do, lots of behaviors that you engage in or you're capable of doing, that are unconscious and sort of subcortical, and you don't need consciousness to do them. Okay, but each of these 8 things you need consciousness to do them. And also you want to think of it as it's active processing. It's things that you are actively doing in your brain, and you're quote unquote thinking about it in consciousness. Okay. Number 2 on the ground rules, um usually, and I would maybe even a majority of the people out there will say, okay, your 4 top functions in your stack are the so-called conscious functions, and then the other 4 functions are your shadow functions or your unconscious functions. Don't think about it that way. Don't think about, if you have TE on your back stack, right? It's like the 7th in your slot or something like that. Don't think of it as every time you do TE, you're doing it unconsciously. That's not correct. Anytime you're using any of these functions, you're doing it consciously. The way to think about the so-called shadow functions, or the functions, 5 through 8 that are in your back stack, is think of it as those are the functions where it just takes extra attention to process that information, right? You sort of have to take yourself out of your sort of your normal state and or sort of your preferred state maybe, and expend some energy processing that information and actively processing it in your consciousness. Okay. And the reason that it's sort of on your back stack is because it's information that you're not sort of, or a domain that you're not necessarily comfortable with all the time, and it just takes more energy. Okay, that spotlight of attention that's bringing things into consciousness, it just has to shine a little bit brighter. Okay, and so you're capable of doing it, and you're capable of doing it consciously. You're not doing this stuff unconsciously. It's just you sort of have to engage in it and then sort of snap back into sort of your normal state. Okay, so those are the two ground rules: active and everything is conscious. Okay, so let's go through the different functions and basically the types of information or the type of processing that you have to do when you're engaging these functions. Okay, so first, we're going to talk about what I'm going to call the engagement functions, or you might think of them as interactive functions. And that's going to be TE and FE. Okay. So, what TE is, well, engagement functions basically mean you are engaging with something in the outside world. So, you are doing something and, to an object or with an object, and it is going to react in a certain way, and then you have to react, counteract to it, right? And so there's an engagement going. You make an action, it has a response, and then you are going to respond to its response, and so on and so forth. Okay, so FE is, to me, sort of the easy one to think about, because when you're using FE, you're engaging with people, you're navigating the social domain. Okay, and so FE is set up to think, to consciously process, okay, if I do this, then how is this person going to react to it? Or how do people typically react to it? And, and I would argue the sort of the stronger you are in FE, the more specific you can be, right? So if I make an off-color joke around, Joe Smith, how is Joe Smith going to react to that? And then how do I have to react to him? And you see it just sort of it's sort of this ongoing cycle, right? I'm going to act, he's going to react, I'm going to react to his reaction. That's FE. Okay. TE is doing that sort of interactive processing and thinking about how things are how things are going to react, but it's doing it with objects as opposed to people. Okay, and so the one example I like to think of is I like to watch people doing TE things on YouTube videos, and things like people making watches, or people like doing like making chef's knives or some sort of metal forgery. One thing that I find real interesting is people who will find like old rusty watches or old rusty lighters, and they do all this stuff and they refurbish it, right? And and I look at it and I'm just like, wow, there's no way you can sort of refurbish this watch. And they do all this stuff and they clean it and they you know do all their TE stuff to it, and presto changeo, they have sort of a new watch or a new lighter, or some new object that looks pristine and new, right? Now that's and what they're using TE to figure out, okay, what steps do I need to take in order to get from point A, rusty old watch, to point B or Z, brand new looking watch. There's a bunch of steps I got to take along the way, and I got to do it usually in a particular order, right? That's TE. And that's figuring out, okay, if I do this, if I pull this lever and push this button and push that lever, how is this object going to react? And you can think of an object as anything other than a person. Okay. And the reason that your brain has two different systems, an FE system and a TE system, is because people are weird, right? People do not all act the same in a way that objects will, right? So if you find an old rusty watch, there's it's you could probably repair it in the same way that you would any other old rusty watch. But with FE, people are different, and so you need a system that is not as linear. I like to describe it as non-linear, and figuring out, okay, this particular person or this particular crowd, this particular social situation, they're going to react in a particular way. Okay, so FE and TE is all about engaging with things in the outside world, right? And consciously thinking about it, right? If I do this, then this is going to happen, and if I do this, then this is going to happen, so on and so forth. Okay. And so everything about FE, being emotive or, trying to find harmony and all that kind of stuff, that's all just sort of a, subset of what's really going on. You're just trying to engage with people, right? And trying to get them to react in a certain way, hopefully. So, okay. So those are the two engagement functions. The next two extroverted functions are NE and SE. And those I refer to as your action functions. And these can be, a little difficult to sort of intuitively understand. SE is about the ability, and again, this is all conscious, right? The ability to shift your consciousness and think about sort of performing and exerting your will or your sort of power into the external world, right? So think of it as your ability to step outside of your mind and put yourself into the theater of the outside world, right? Um, and a lot of that can be described as, exerting force, exerting power, but basically taking yourself out of your head and putting yourself into the world, right? So, it could be, simple things like hitting a ball with a bat, or, cleaning your room, or anything like that, right? Now, yes, when you're engaging with people and engaging with objects, yes, you are putting yourself into the outside world. But what you're doing consciously in FE and TE is thinking about, okay, how is this going to unfold, right? SE is actually having enough attention to actually focus on what you're doing outside in the world, right? And so think about, just a simple thing like folding the laundry or something, but you have to consciously think about it because it's sort of a new thing that you've never done, right? Like, you might be able to fold your t-shirts without thinking about it and sort of do it unconsciously. And that's not really a whole lot of SE. But then you get like those fitted, bed sheets, right? That are just impossible to fold, or like baby clothes or something that are just like impossible to fold, and you have to like think about, okay, how do I got to focus my attention out into the external theater long enough to sort of make sure that I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. And yes, you are, also using some TE to sort of figure out how all that stuff works, but you also need the attention to put yourself into the external world. So hopefully that makes sense. SE is kind of hard to intuitively think about. NE is sort of the same way, except instead of putting yourself into the outside world and into what I call the outside theater, you are putting your ideas into the outside theater, right? And you're sort of putting those out and exploring the metaphysical space. And so your attention is going not to, what is physically in front of you and things that you need to pay attention to, um, but instead it's sort of in your, um, in your metaphysical but still conscious thoughts of, okay, how could things unfold, right, at sort of a large scale, um, and what are the different possibilities here, right? And again, you're going to use your INI and your FE together to sort of, figure out possibilities with social domain, and maybe your INI and your TE to sort of figure out possibilities in the object oriented domain. But it really is about getting your ideas out there. Okay. So that's one way. That's a quick and dirty way of thinking of INI. Okay, so that's all the extroverted stuff. Now the introverted stuff. Um, so TI and FI are what I'm going to call the deliberative functions, where essentially you have to come up with an answer of basically how to categorize something. Okay, is to me the best way of thinking of it. So TI is going to use conditional logic, right? So if I tell you that all birds can fly and a chicken is a bird, now your immediate reaction is probably, well, chickens don't fly, so therefore your proposition that all birds can fly is not true, right? And so TI is just constantly using that sort of logic to figure out how to categorize things and how to sort of build up your sort of your semantic base, right? Your knowledge about the world, right? So if I, very early in your life, you might have thought, okay, all birds fly because most of the birds you encounter fly. But then eventually you learn about chickens and you learn about emus and penguins and other sorts of birds that don't fly. And so you're constantly sort of reevaluating things and restructuring your TI knowledge base, right? And that's all TI. And again, you're consciously doing it, right? When I tell you all birds can fly and a chicken is a bird, that springs into consciousness your TI. No, that's not true, right? And so we have to readjust what we think of as birds. Okay. So that's TI. And again, it's just sort of figuring out if something's validly true or not, and then, shifting your propositions or your conditional knowledge along the way. Okay. Um, and one thing I want to point out is no matter how you feel about chickens, whether you like chickens or not, or how you feel about birds, whether you like birds or not, it's not going to change the TI result, right? And so, when people say things like, facts don't have feelings, that kind of thing, that's sort of what they're getting at, right? TI is not making any sort of value judgment, or making any sort of, preference. It's just pure logic. Does it fit into this category or does it not? Okay. Um, and it sort of grows at a very large scale. And so you do very big TI things. But the chicken and bird thing is a very simple example of it. FI, however, is about preferences, right? Whether or not you assign a positive value, like this thing is going to give me a benefit, or a negative value, this thing is going to have some sort of detriment, right? Or you could be ambivalent about it, and sometimes it's positive in some situations and sometimes it's negative in other situations. but in general, you're assigning some sort of value to it. And like in my video about Descartes' error, what that's doing is it's allowing you to come up with priorities. It's allowing you to come up with preferences about things and do sort of long-term planning. And again, you're sort of categorizing things, but you're not categorizing things on any sort of, semantic base or logical base, right? Is it a chicken or is it a bird? It's a value based thing. Is this thing a benefit to me or is it a detriment to me? Okay. And your brain, again, has evolved two different ways of categorizing things in the world, because you need both, right? Because if you only had TI, then you're not going to have sort of like I talked about in the Descartes error, everything could make logical sense, but you need to at some point have a preference, right? Like if you're going to prioritize things, you need to be able to have some sort of preference. And so in TI world, if you just shut off FI completely and just relied on TI, it's almost impossible to make a decision because, no matter how much logic you apply to an FI situation, you're not going to be able to come up with a preference or a priority list, right? And so just like no matter what you think about chickens, if you like them or not, it's not going to change the fact whether or not they're a bird. Same thing applies to FI type of things. No matter how much logic you might put behind, a preference, it's really not going to change anything, right? FI is doing its own thing in its own way, right? Okay. So that's FI and TI. And again, they're making sort of deliberative conclusions on basically how to categorize things, right? Okay, using FI, is this positive or is it negative to me? Or using TI, where does it fit in sort of my overall schema, or my semantic based knowledge of the world? Okay. All right, so those are the deliberative functions, coming up with conclusions about things. And then SI and NI are about knowledge. And so again, this gets a little tricky because you want to, again, think of it as conscious processing that you're doing. And so if I asked you, what's your mom's birthday, right? Or, when was Napoleon crowned emperor? That kind of stuff. Chances are you're going to have to use SI, right? Because you're maybe it's some way, at some point along the way, you had an experience that gave you that information, and you have to consciously recall that information to generate a response. Okay, you're not just going to unconsciously blurt out your mom's birthday. You sort of have to consciously think about it, and recall it. Now, how we do it, I have no idea, but that is one of the things that consciousness does, right? So if somebody comes to you and says, okay, what did Sally say to you at the party the other night? Okay, well, I have to consciously recall my experience to come up to generate an answer. Okay. And that's SI, using your experience to generate a knowledge-based answer. Like, what do you know? Now, and it could be either sort of an event or something like, what's your mom's birthday? You might not remember the exact day or time when you learned what your mom's birthday is, but you still have to consciously recall it to generate an answer. Yes, there is some overlap with TI, right? You're sort of categorizing things along the way. So all of these functions are sort of interacting with each other, but think of it as, what are you being asked to do? Well, I'm being asked to generate some sort of response based off of my SI. SI also is a lot of time described with, just sort of how you're internally feeling. Like, do you feel cozy? Do you feel cold? Do you feel too hot? And I think that is part of SI. And I mean, the funny or sort of the thing worth noting is, memories, like remembering events, they're very tied to your subcortical emotional sort of lizard brain areas, right? The hippocampus, different parts of what we call the limbic system. And when people have damage to those limbic systems, not only do they have sort of a hard time regulating emotion and just sort of, whether they're cold or hot, that kind of stuff, but they also sort of lose the ability to recall episodes, recall episodic type of memory. So there is something there about, your ability to recall information being tied to sort of your internal state, right? It's all connected. Very interesting stuff. So if you hear that SI is all about sort of how you feel internally, yeah, that's sort of a part of it, but it's also just sort of recording your experiences, right? Um, and so if you have to consciously, again, come up with some sort of, what did Sally say to you the other night at the party? Some sort of experiential knowledge, you're going to use your SI. With NI, that's going to be knowledge that, things that but not based off of any particular experience, right? It's, again, sort of reading between the lines, kind of, sometimes people will describe it as putting two and two together, but it's essentially your pet theories about the world that, you know, basically you come up with. And hopefully they're grounded in some sort of, reality. Um, but you're basically coming up with sort of a knowledge about, somebody or something or some event, um, without ever having somebody actually explain to you or give you that piece of knowledge, right? So you could think about, a question like, is, does Sally, instead of saying, what did Sally say to the other night, which is an SI sort of experience thing, it could be more like, does Sally like you, right? Well, I don't know. She's never really said. She's never told anybody else, but my intuition tells me, based off of, our interactions and how she acts, yeah, I think she does, right? But there's real no direct experience where for sure, right? Um, unless somebody specifically told you, oh yeah, she likes you. Um, or things like, what caused the Civil War, right? Now there's lots of explanations. There's lots of things you've probably read or heard read in history books or heard in history documentaries, but you're going to come up with sort of your pet theory, right? Of, what you really think caused the American Civil War. And there's a lot feeding into that, right? Or, just really any other sort of knowledge, things that you quote unquote know to be true, but you don't have any direct experience. Like, what's the best way to make money? I don't know. Right. And again, there's a bit of FI bleeding in there. There might be a little bit of TI bleeding in there, right? You need to use those things to sort of support your NI knowledge base, right? None of this stuff is happening in a vacuum, unless you have brain damage, and then it gets real interesting. But um, but your NI is ultimately coming up with some sort of answer, right? Some sort of thing that you know, um, but nobody's ever told you. You never actually experienced it. Okay. Okay, so that's the quick and dirty explanation of the functions. Now, of course, there's a lot of caveats, there's a lot of nuances, there might be some exceptions, and there's a lot of gray area where, SE sort of looks like TE in some respects. But if you're going to sort of understand the way the brain works and how all these cognitive functions work, you have to get comfortable with those sorts of nuances and sometimes inconsistencies. um, and be able to sort of parse out the concepts from each other enough to where, yeah, there's some overlap, there's some gray area, but you have a general sense of what each of them is doing independently. And then, like I said, it gets real interesting when you encounter patients with certain types of lesions or injuries to the brain where it effectively knocks out one of those functions, right? And where they can do all the other seven functions, usually, but they just have a really hard time with that eighth function, or the function that where it's affected by the brain injury. Again, all of these are conscious. It's all things that you have to consciously process, but it's all different types of information. Okay. And again, just because you might have any, in your fifth slot or sixth slot or eighth slot or whatever, doesn't mean when you engage in any, you're doing it unconsciously. I don't know where that came from. I'm sure it's some interpretation of Jung, and maybe he even said it, explicitly. Um, but I would recommend not thinking about it that way, because it's just going to completely confuse you when you're trying to assess, the different types and why the different types are sort of engaging the functions differently, right? It's all about your spotlight of attention and how much energy or brain resources you need to use to focus that spotlight on whatever function it is you're using. Okay. So again, hopefully that makes sense. If I said anything that doesn't make sense, or you want me to elaborate on the nuance, feel free to leave a comment and I will do that. Okay. Now, watch out for the next video where I'm going to talk about how to actually use that information to help you with either typing yourself or typing other people. Okay. Talk to you soon. Bye.